Welcome to the latest edition of our AT Kearney Procurement and Analytics Solutions The Wave of the Future podcast series. I'm Helen Clegg, and I'm joined today by Scott Brown, Library Services Manager for Qualcomm, based in the greater San Diego area. Scott is an experienced information research professional, educator, coach, and researcher, and is on the adjunct faculty of the University of San Jose State University. In this podcast, Scott is going to share with us tips and tricks on how best to leverage social media platforms as tools for research and competitive intelligence. So Scott, welcome to our podcast series. It's great to have you join us. I'd like to start by comparing and contrasting the characteristics of traditional research tools with social media tools. From your experience, what's the difference between a commercial online database such as a Factiva or ProQuest with a social media platform such as Twitter?
Well, Helen, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. So a few of the differences that I see are these. So one is traditional research tools tend to have a structured search function, a structured browse function. So they have a taxonomy, they typically have advanced search features, which help the user to get the relevant information out of the database. The data within them typically have a relative sense of reliability of the information. You can generally assume that the information is reliable and from trusted sources. They also typically have a stable platform and interface. It doesn't change a lot. The structure doesn't change. The platform, the interface doesn't change a lot. And so because of all of those factors, researchers are able to build up a certain expertise in searching them. You can get better and better, and after a while, you kind of reach that expert status. With social tools, all of those factors are different. So the search effectiveness varies wildly, and typically it's terrible. There is typically very little taxonomy, if any taxonomy. They're constantly changing, so the interface can look very different from one day to the next, and LinkedIn actually is a great example of that. And the information, certainly relative to traditional tools, is questionable. But it's not inherently unreliable, and we'll probably get into that a little bit more as we chat. The other thing is it's really hit or miss. When you're using social media tools, you never know if you're going to hit the gold mine or if you're going to come up empty-handed. And so as opposed to building up an expertise, social tools really require a creativity in approach. And I think researchers need to be constantly learning and relearning how to search those tools. So those are some of the prime differences that I see between those two sets of tools.
I think that's really interesting, Scott, about the fact that you need creativity in approach when you're searching social media tools. So my next question to you is, when is it better to use a social media tool versus one of those traditional online tools? Or is it a case of taking a two-pronged approach to research and using both types of tools? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it really is a two-pronged approach. I think both traditional tools and social tools can lead into valuable information. To kind of step back a moment, I by no means believe that social media is a silver bullet. Again, sometimes you hit gold, you hit the jackpot, and other times it's just a bust. But the beauty of it is, I think social tools and traditional tools complement each other. So that if I find a lead, say, on a particular product from a competitor within a traditional tool, I can then jump over to social media and see what kind of buzz I can find around that particular product. It's really nice to do that kind of back and forth between the two. Very rarely, I think, is there a case where you would exclusively use one or the other, except for cases like financials, for example, company financials. Oftentimes, that's something that you're only going to find in traditional tools, though I have seen examples where you only find it in social media tools. But the real advantage, I think, or one of the real advantages of social media is it's great for getting familiar with an industry quickly, especially one that you're not familiar with, because it does have that real-time buzz. It does have that kind of top of the mind feel to it. So whether you're looking at an oil and gas industry, high tech industry, pharmaceutical, you can relatively quickly get up to speed.
Right, yeah, no, I would agree with that. Would you say there are any other benefits that spring to mind from using social media platforms? I mean, that was a really interesting example where you can get that real-time information on that particular industry or competitor. But what are any other benefits that you can think of that aren't available from conducting the same sort of research using those traditional databases?
Yeah, so there is some unique content, and as we've touched upon, there is that buzz, and what's really interesting about the buzz piece of it, or the real time piece of it, is I think we both worked with market research reports, and oftentimes by the time a market research firm starts to cover a market, that market is already well established and oftentimes on its way to commodity status. With social media, you can really capture a market that's growing and emerging in a way that's just not available in traditional tools. The other piece that I think is really interesting about social tools is it really captures the human side of the business and the customer side. So you can see where people are going and where they're coming from as far as being employed at a company, what kind of skills they're using. And then on the customer side, there's just a huge amount of sentiment that's out there and available where previously you would have needed to form a focus group in order to get some of the customer information that is freely available out there in social media tools. On the unique content side, it's just to share one example. So, for example, in LinkedIn, you can find skills associated with particular companies and with particular higher educational institutions. That kind of information simply is not available elsewhere. Granted, it is based on who's participating in LinkedIn, but it's a unique form of information that, again, is simply not available anywhere else.
Right. No, 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 you're absolutely right. It is very unique. So, Scott, let's suppose I want to find out about a company that I may want to consider doing business with. From a procurement perspective, let's say there's a potential supplier I want to do business with. What social media tools should I use as a starting point?
So traditionally, you would obviously start, one of the pieces of information that you want to gather would be from your traditional tools like Dun and Bradstreet. Find out credit ratings, credit reports, and those kinds of things. On the social media side, what I would do is start with their main page and see, are there particular social media tools on which they actively participate and that they actually promote via their site. And those are the first channels that I would tend to go down. But I wouldn't limit myself to that. So, for example, I might go to Facebook, and if it's a supplier, if there's someone there that's on Facebook, take a look and see what kind of comments are there. You might do that as well on their company page if they're participating in LinkedIn as well. There may be comments, there may be particular things they're talking about, there might be particular positions they're hiring for that can give you a clue as to what their business might be like or where their business might be going. And then certainly looking at things, if they have a Twitter feed, if they're blogging, how do they talk about themselves? How do they position themselves? What do they see as their strengths? And is it possible to discern weaknesses from those kinds of comments as well? The final thing that I would look at that I think is an interesting resource, but I think oftentimes researchers forget about, are review sites like Yelp. Increasingly, it's not just restaurants or pubs that are on Yelp, but business to business companies. A lot of different companies are starting to be reviewed. Service companies are getting reviewed on Yelp, and those can often provide some interesting insights about companies that you're going to start dealing with.
Yeah, that makes absolutely perfect sense. And just actually, an interesting site I came across the other day was, I think it was called the Company.com, and basically what it was instead of using a traditional directory to find company information or an overview of a supplier, what this site does is it provides you with an overview of a company, but then it includes ratings from people who've done business with that company. And I thought that was really interesting. So it's not social media per se, but it's actually a website where they're using that social information from users or people who've done business with that company to actually put ratings against that particular company. I thought that was interesting.
That is very interesting, and it's a model that's, I think, increasingly in use these days. I mean, for years now, students have been able to rate their teachers publicly online, which is a good thing and a bad thing, perhaps. And then there's also sites like Glassdoor.com, which allows you some insight into how companies hire and what their interview process is like,
Right.
and all of those kinds of things, which I think is very valuable as well and provides a different kind of insight.
Yeah, no, absolutely, it does. Um, so We've talked a little bit about using the different social media tools to find information on a potential supplier or a company that you want to do business with. What about this human element? So, Scott, what about finding experts on a specific industry or topic? Because oftentimes when you're doing research, you think, well, I really want to connect with someone who knows that industry or topic. And how can we use social media to do that, to find those experts? Any tips there?
There are a few tools that immediately come to mind in finding and locating expertise. So number one, and one of the probably easiest ways to determine expertise, in my opinion, is through blogs. So for example, Wall Street Journal author blogs. But simply doing even a Google blog search, you can relatively quickly not only find posts, but also it helps identify what those blogs are where experts are speaking about a particular topic. And so that's kind of my first go-to place as far as finding expertise. My second place is typically through LinkedIn groups. As you and I were discussing earlier, there are so many LinkedIn groups there, and a lot of them around particular topic areas, and being able to find those groups, locate those groups, and see who's participating in those groups, that's a really valuable tool. And oftentimes you can find what I think of as hidden experts, those people that have that body of expertise, but they might not be publicly blogging or feel comfortable putting their opinions out in a broader range. And the nice thing about LinkedIn is it allows you a mechanism to then connect with those experts if you're interested in doing that. A third one is many of these question and answer forums like Quora, Quora, where people put out questions and people answer those questions as well. There's certainly things like Yahoo Answers, but a site like Quora is a little bit more credible. People can build up essentially social capital on those sites so that they have a certain amount of credibility based upon how people rate their answers. So that's another source as well. Kind of the last resort in a way would be something like Twitter, because it's definitely a bit trickier to identify experts, but oftentimes you can see and locate sometimes people within companies who are tweeting about a particular topic or posting about a particular topic that have a very, very niche expertise. And so that's certainly a resource to be considered, but not something I'd go to necessarily right off the bat.
Right, yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Certainly blogs, there are lots of people out there writing blogs, and I think it is definitely a good place to find expertise. Quora I haven't used, but I've seen it advertised, and I think correct me if I'm mistaken, if you do a Bing search or Google search, doesn't Quora appear to the right so you can see who's sort of got expertise on the topic that you're searching? It appears on the right-hand side of your screen.
Yes, I think you can have that set up that way, and they will surface in your regular search results as well.
Right, right. So, Scott, one thing I'm always wary of when conducting research is the source of the data, and I think you touched on this earlier. So, data, the source of data is really important when you're doing research, and the question around authoritative, how authoritative is that source of data? But with social media, it's so completely different. So, what's your take on this with regard to using these social media tools for conducting research?
Yes, so social media definitely needs to be taken with a grain of salt. At its worst, social media is simply a huge rumor mill. But again, how much of some of our best leads come from rumors based on rumors? So, and again, that's at its worst. At its best, what you've got, as we've touched on, are experts sharing their opinion and sharing information that simply isn't in articles or reports. It's more informal, and oftentimes it's very rich and very interesting. But my advice around kind of checking validity is make sure you cross check, and that's where I tie back to the approach of using both traditional tools and social media tools as kind of a cross check. So you find something in social media, perhaps a partner being mentioned of a company, you might want to go then into your EBSCO or your Nexus and take a look and see what kind of information you can find there based upon that company name
Mm-hmm.
search. and vice versa. And if you're not able to validate, and oftentimes you're not able to, note that. It doesn't mean that that information isn't necessarily true, but it's information that you can certainly surface to your client or simply keep track of for yourself. To continue to see if something actually develops out of that. Again, you sometimes don't know because it, again, sometimes is like a
Right.
big rumor mill.
I was just going to say, I think that the most important thing is to, if you can't cross-check and validate, is to actually just know where it came from and make that source very prominent so people realize that there is no other way of validating it. But having said that, like you said, it could actually turn out to be a really, really important piece of information.
Yeah. And I think social media is interesting because it really does kind of turn on its head the notion of authority. So, say you've got CNET reporting on something that a developer in Microsoft said, and then you've got the developer's blog. Who do you trust? Do you trust what would be the traditional reporting source of CNET, or do you trust the blogger themselves? And there's reasons to trust one or the other depending upon the situation. But it really does, I think,
Mm.
challenge us as researchers in how we approach authority and validity.
Yeah, that's a really interesting comment. I hadn't really thought about that, but absolutely. Because some of those bloggers out there, they know an awful lot of information and they're spot on their topic or category, right?
Yep.
Okay, so Scott, what about moving on to talk a little bit about competitive intelligence, which again is so useful to companies to find that competitive edge. It's all about uncovering those things that are happening in companies that haven't necessarily made it into the public domain. So, given that, in what ways can social media tools help uncover what's going on in competitors that a company might be tracking?
So there are several different examples and several different ways that I think you can use it. But let me use Twitter as an example. So I won't name names, but there is a UK-based oil and gas production company that has a Twitter feed out there. And if you take a look, I'll give a couple examples of ways to potentially approach this. So if you take a look at who they are following, so those Twitter accounts that they are interested in getting the updates on, if you look through their follower list or who they're following, you'll find a lot of interesting stuff. So they're following all the major oil and gas companies, gas exploration companies, but they're also following a lot of government-based entities that are tweeting in Syria and other Middle East areas. And so it's interesting to see the geographies of where they're tracking and the kind of entities that they're tracking. And just recently, they've added a few Canadian oil sands accounts, which I think is really interesting and perhaps indicating a change in direction or a change in focus for that company. Now, that may be something that you'd be able to find through press releases or through other ways as well, but it's kind of an alternative way and potentially an under the radar way that they might be looking at changing their focus. Now, the second piece of that, using the same example, is if you look at what they're tweeting, with this particular company, they actually are using a hashtag with their company name as well. So they're tweeting as their company, but then they're also tagging themselves. And if you take a look at the hashtag, which anyone can use, you find other people tweeting about that company, but tweeting things that the company itself might not feel comfortable tweeting. So, for example, people tweeting about frozen interests, majority ownership of the company, all of those kinds of things, and that surfaces really quickly. The advantage, again, of doing something like this is it's kind of following these threads that you may or may not find via traditional search. And literally, it took me, in building this example, it took me about 15 minutes of investigation to not only locate where their geographic areas of interest were, but also what were the issues that they were dealing with, how were they positioning themselves, and how were other people talking about it, and surfacing some really interesting stuff. And again, that's over 15 minutes of investigation. So it's really a potentially powerful tool. And to go back to our initial point of being able to get up to speed on an industry or competitor relatively quickly to see what those strengths are and what those pain points are as well.
Yeah, it's certainly very interesting to see what's going on in the social media world and get that immediacy around a particular topic or industry and see who's following whom. So, Scott, as we come to wrap up this podcast, which has been a really interesting topic, what are your 3 top tips for using social media tools for research?
So if I were to name my top three, it really depends upon your use. But as a general rule, number one would be if you're pursuing a company or an industry or some kind of topic in depth, try everything. Try all the tools. Go broadly. Normally, you're not going to do that as you start to get comfortable with the tools and know your companies or your competitors that you're tracking, but try everything at first because you never know what you're going to find in a source that you would never guess you would find. So, for example, finding an interesting company presentation in SlideShare. It's not necessarily the first place that I'd go, but sometimes you can find some really interesting stuff there. The second is, even if you've tried a tool before and found it not very effective, if it's been 6 months or more, go in and try it again because the tools change and evolve very quickly and functionality and information can grow very quickly. That's my second one. Third one, as we've touched on, is simply be curious and creative in using these tools. It does require a certain amount of creativity, and it's not like a Nexus where it's relatively obvious that you would search a particular file for a particular type of information. With social tools, you really need to think creatively about what kind of information can I find and what does that information mean to me. It requires a little bit more interpretation on our part as researchers, and that I think is a key to using these tools effectively.
Well, Scott, that was an incredible view of social media tools for research, and I've certainly learned a lot through what you've been saying. So, really, just to summarize, social media tools offer a wealth of information. It's not always possible to be to know the source, or it can't always be authoritative, but you have to be aware of that. And it's really, good to have that mindset of being curious and creative when using the tools because they bring another element to research. And social media tools can be used for really everything from tracking companies, suppliers, and also gathering competitive intelligence. So, on that note, Scott, I'd like to thank you ever so much for being my guest today. And I'd also like to thank our production engineer, Tom Klein, based in San Francisco. Thank you for listening to this edition of The Wave of the Future. If you have any comments on this podcast or have a suggestion for a podcast topic, please share your thoughts via Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @ATKPAS. This has been an AT Kearney Procurement and Analytics Solutions podcast production. Join us again soon for our next Wave of the Future podcast.